Hello and welcome back to our million part Bible series. Today we're going to be going through Matthew 31 to 42. So we've been at this a little while with all of our Sermon on the Mount coverage. And before we even dive into this, let's really take a second to think about what all these things mean. What's the link between all the things so far with the Sermon on the Mount? It's the sermon is a resetting of Israel's understanding of getting into heaven. We've talked about this before. At this point, people thought that just by being Jews, they would be welcomed there. That Abraham would wait at the gates of hell, and if a Jew happened to go down there, no matter what he did, Abraham would give them the thumbs up, and they'd be on their way back up. And it is a complete travesty for any kind of moral system to think that no matter what you do, you're still going to get in. Just don't eat your meat with your cheese when you're pretty much good to go. So Matthew 31 to 42 brings up a few more examples of things that the Pharisees had said, things that the oral Torah had said that were not moral or even close to what God wanted from his people. So it goes, it has been said, remember what the big difference between it was written and it was said. Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In terms of oaths, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or even by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. We get into our eye for an eye. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them and offer the left. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile with them, go 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So these rules that we're hearing here all reference things that were going on in the Jewish society for many years that have been written into the Mishnah, and that's what he's referring to uh, in here, the Pharisaical law. So let's start off with divorce and what Jesus says. So it's a big issue. Divorce, especially now more than ever, affects so many people in different ways, whether or not you've had a divorce or someone you knew or were close to. And it's always a real mess. No matter what, it's a very sad thing that happens. And in chapter 19, Jesus goes far more into it than he is here. But at this point, he's just breaking down what God wants as opposed to what the Pharisees and the Mishnah, the oral law, have been saying that God wants. So we'll get more into the details on divorce later on. But he says, remember, it is said, and this is referencing Deuteronomy 24. And Jesus says that anyone who divorces their wife makes them commit adultery. To understand what this means, we need to look at what goes on in the society at this time. So if a woman's husband died, or even if they had land given to her, they still would have a tough time doing the farm work. They would need someone to help them out. So a woman at this point, even when they had the benefit of getting more and more land and resources, still had to be under someone's provision. She couldn't get a job. If her husband kicked her out, she would have no means of support. They'd be kicked out without the clothes on their back. And because she's still married, no other man would go near her because he would be getting accused of adultery. So she was in literal serious danger here. So God says in Deuteronomy that a man has to give this letter or certificate of divorce to his wife so that another man could take her on as his own wife. This is simply providing the victim mercy, or less she could actually die here. So what's going on here is not that God is permitting divorce or saying it's not a big deal, or that if you just give us this certificate, it's all well and good. He's looking at it as a way of providing some kind of chance for this woman to live. And you see this happen a lot in the laws. If you think about the slavery clauses, and we'll get more into that, they're about limiting bad behavior, not giving people permission. In this, with divorce, it's the same exact thing. In Exodus 22:16, we hear about if a man seduces a woman before being married, he must pay a dowry and make them his wife. This doesn't mean that God approves of sex before marriage, but he's mitigating the negatives of the aftermath. And the Pharisees were saying that this certificate request shows that God allows divorce. So they added it to the Mishnah, and then what do they do? What do they usually do? They keep going with it. They keep adding more and more. So all sorts of new reasons were given in the Mishnah about what could justify divorce. The silliest one is that a man could divorce his wife if she burns his soup. And you can imagine this was written. Whenever I hear that, I think about like a guy and the wife just ruins the soup every single night. And they're all giving their reasons. And he says, you know what? You know what? What about, when they burn soup? And then all of his dudes, all of his buddies were, okay, write it down. Write it down, or just speak it out loud, or say that God said that to Moses all those years before. Something truly ridiculous about this, and you can see why Jesus is so opposed to the Mishnah, and how God must have been very opposed to the Mishnah as well. So if a man divorces his wife, they're forcing them to commit adultery. And the only other option is death. That's why they're forcing somebody to commit adultery, because they have to go and they have to find a man to allow them to live and to help them live. So if they just go on their own, they'll be a beggar. They'll probably die. There aren't a lot of options at this point for women. So you could see what he means by forcing them to be an adulteress. Jesus also says that if a man marries such a woman, he's committing adultery too. And that these certificates didn't change the marriage in God's eyes. It just gave these women a chance at survival. The divorce was still a sin. And then this entire chain of sin follows that ends up entangling another guy who had nothing to do with the initial divorce. The only caveat here is in case of a sexual crime or sexual adultery while being married. So, of course, a man can't force a woman to be an adulteress if she's already beat him to it. But keep in mind, if you're feeling bad, if you're divorced out there, or you know somebody and care about them, divorce is a sin, but it's not any worse than any other sin. We've been going through it a lot in our previous ones. Have you ever lusted for someone? Have you ever disliked a person or thought bad things about them? And you're right there with these people who have committed adultery. The best thing you could do when encountering these people or them coming into the church is to set that moment right there that they could work on and do the best they can in their life moving forward to please God and to please to please the world. So it's something to think about here. A lot of times in churches, you hear about people who get really shamed for divorce. People stop coming because of an issue. It's a sin. It's a big deal, but it's not something. Oh, if you do this, you're gonna go to hell no matter what you do. That's a pretty ridiculous, ridiculous thing. Jesus will catch everybody in the Bible. If you are sitting there and thinking, well, I could probably get in there without Jesus. Well, you're sinning because you're lying. So keep reading. It's gonna catch everybody. Now then we get to this part about taking an oath. And any agreement really is a vow. Loans, military, being a witness, marriage. It's a yes or a no. That's all that matters. And so what do the Pharisees do? They start giving reasons how you can get out of an oath. They'd be excused if you swore by the wrong thing or not. And this is what Jesus is referring to when he's talking about the footstool of God. And they said, oh, if you swear to God, it's always binding. But if you swore by the heavens and earth, they're going to pass away. I mean, so it's not really something you could swear by. If you're facing Jerusalem, well, then it counts. If you're not, you might not. So people start this nonsense and they start swearing and they're thinking about excuses the entire time. So bad businessmen are trying to figure out, try to trick this room to make it look like I'm facing Jerusalem. And then later on they would say in court or to whoever that, well, that contract, that promise was not binding because of this. It ends up into this really ludicrous ludicrous time where you have these things going on. And Jesus says that swearing by heaven and earth are the same as swearing on God. He's up there. He's in there. He's not buying the system. He's mocking it more than anything. Jesus says you're not making promises on things that you can't control. If you put your life for ransom as the oath, you can't change a single hair on your head. So you can't assure what's going to be happening in the future. What if there are things in the way that you can't possibly change? So he basically says, don't take these. Don't take an oath. There's no requirement in the law to do so. If you're faithful through your intentions, why do you need an oath? Just do your yes and no. That the type of people that do this are usually not very trustworthy. If someone tells the truth, you don't need them to swear in a stack of Bibles. And think about, in your experience, the people who do this. I swear, swear, swear. They're usually people that have lied. When somebody you can trust says something, you typically go with them without making them swear to God. And then we get to the eye for an eye. And the next 2 or 3 videos in this series that we're going to do are so fun because Jesus was a prolific quote maker. When you look at what's being said in these things, there's so many quotes where people have quoted for that long since it happened. And sometimes you even forget that they come out in the Bible. But he had some real good ones in here. So a lot of people, this begs a really cool question. So when we get to the eye for an eye, is that a contradiction? So in the Old Testament, we hear about this eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now Jesus is saying turn the other cheek. So is that a contradiction in the Bible? Some people explain this in a lot of different ways. Some people will say, oh, well, Jesus reverses everything in the Old Testament. You could see he's not doing that. He's referring to the Mishnah and man-made laws. He's not saying forget everything you read in the Old Testament. So what exactly is going on here? In the same way that we talked about the contract being given, a certificate given to women in divorce, he's not approving of these things. He's asking about measuring out law fairly. That's the goal of that original tenet. That's the spirit of the law. Don't demand something more valuable that was taken for you. You don't take an eye. If somebody took a tooth from you, you had your choice. Which would you take? And it makes sense. So the Pharisees took it hyper literally and interpreted it for vengeance. That God wants you to go take any kind of vengeance. That's not what it's about. It's about putting a governor on the human tendency to sin against those who offend in far greater magnitudes than the original sin ever happened. So, like I said, in the same way that the certificate was minimizing collateral damage, it's not an excuse uh, to divorce in any way. It's not an excuse for somebody who's not married to sleep with somebody. That's fornication. It's not an excuse to have slavery, but it is simply something that is going to be put in there to make sure that those who are doing those things can't do it to the full extent that they want to do. All of these things are examples of God's mercy, to encourage mercy. The spirit of the law is to not be interested in retribution. So that's how Jesus is bringing this back and saying that he's not taking anything away. But this is the obvious initial interpretation of it. If you didn't have people telling you all these other lies with their Pharisaical type thinking. So Jesus had a lot worse than a slap happen to him. Won't spoil much. But he didn't do anything. Righteousness isn't about the adherence to the laws, it's about the adherence to the Spirit. So, all of this turn the other cheek stuff, all this stuff about not wanting to hurt people who hurt you, not insult those who insult you, and when people hear those things, they tend to put themselves in the place of the injured party. It's very easy to always do that. But what if you're the one who's offending? You were offending God. You were sinning, which offended God. Before you came to mercy with Christ, you were offensive. So you came to Jesus demanding all of these things that you had no right to have. You were the one that said, "Can I have your coat? Can I have your hat? Can I have your weed whacker?" while being rude and not returning them. And how did Jesus respond to you? Jesus didn't resist you. You asked him to walk a mile with you, and he walked too. You can't. I don't want to go to the hell. And he said, "All right, you have a place with me, a role in my kingdom moving forward." It was more than anybody even asked for. So, with that all in mind, how can you do the opposite to those who offend you when you've been offensive? You're here to be the hands and feet of the Spirit and to reach out and reach others in the world to bring them to Jesus. It's not about slapping people back or getting your vengeance. And that's the big theme here. You can't get into heaven alone because you don't measure up. We talked about that before. We all have sins. It's not just the divorced people. We don't measure up. But Jesus did, and pleasing him and being a disciple is how to get there. You don't follow nonsense laws while not having mercy and not being righteous. That's not going to get you there. So, the next few episodes, we're going to be getting into a few more of those classic Jesus lines. Some of them have been grossly misinterpreted in really sad ways. The pearls before swine thing, a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, I want to thank you very much for coming. I know it took us a little while to get this one out. We're trying some different stuff, moving around projects, trying to do a prophecy video. But we'll keep this one going, and can't wait to hear everybody's feedback. Thank you very much, and take care.